So wasn't that a fun little parable? Yeah, what's he going to say about that? Well, this passage does need a little bit of setup. So let me begin by saying that this is a Holy Week passage. Did you realize that? That's where this passage comes. The cross for Jesus is only a few days away. So there's an intensity with this passage that we don't often feel this time of year. So why is this passage here today, 6 months before Easter? It's a good question. I'm glad you asked. Well, we're getting close to the end of the church year. Church year starts with the first Sunday in Advent, which this year is December 3rd. Sometimes it ends, or it begins on the last Sunday of November. So we're getting close to that. And so the lectionary makes its way through the gospel, and this year it's Matthew. And so we're getting to the end of the church year, so we're getting to the end of the gospel. And so here we are with this passage. Now, what makes this even more difficult for us is that there are allusions we often miss. There are allusions that the Jewish listeners knew right away. But sometimes we don't quite get it because we don't know the stories that well. This Wednesday night, as we were looking through the Old Testament, a couple of people talked about churches that they knew of that basically said, all we need is the gospel. We don't need the Old Testament. We just need the gospel. That's where Jesus is. And, there's some sense to that. At least we need the New Testament part. But Jesus often quoted from the Old Testament. And the things he did and said, they knew from the stories of the prophets and others. And so not to know the Old Testament is sometimes to miss things. And there are a couple references that were easily understood in today's passage that we might miss. The first is this story is sort of a retelling of the story from Isaiah 5. They would have known that. They would have had that in their heads. They go, oh, yeah, he's talking about, yeah. So they would have known. And the reference to the cornerstone was taken from Psalm 118. That essentially said, the Messiah will be the cornerstone will be rejected. So, unless we pick those up, we kind of pull in late to the story. So for many of those reasons, this parable can surprise us. It's sneaky. It's sneaky. We get mad, but we're not sure what we're to get mad about. Right? Those lousy tenant farmers. What's the matter with them? Well, this parable, like a lot of other parables that Jesus tells, needs a warning label. Right? Contents may not be suitable for the self-righteous. So be careful. Now, when we look at this, and often it's been interpreted as anti-Jewish, right? The Jews were those who were taking God for granted, and they were going to be thrown out of it. But that's not what it's about. It's about the religious leaders who were taking God for granted. The question really is about faithfulness versus unfaithfulness, which is a key biblical concept. And this is where it draws us in, because it asks us the same question. Are we faithful or are we not? Jesus tells a story about these wicked tenants who act as if the owner's land and property is their own. It's not. Exactly. The chief priests and the Pharisees agree with Jesus until they realize that Jesus is talking about them. Right? We're okay with this parable until we realize that, oh, maybe it's talking about me. And that's more difficult. They are the ones who act as if God's kingdom was theirs and have rejected the Son. This section starts a little bit earlier when chief priests and the scribes, the religious leaders, come to Jesus, who's doing good, who's teaching wonderful things, and they say to him, who told you you could do this? By what authority are you doing this? Which sets up the sense of the tenants. Now, You'll notice that the vineyard was planted, fenced, improved by the master. The tenants simply leased the land. It wasn't theirs. They could enjoy the fruits of it, but it ultimately was not theirs. Now, however, the warning is for us. We have to understand that we are now the tenants of God's vineyard. We are those who enjoy the blessings of God, and what will we do with that? Will we act graciously, faithfully to God? Fred Rogers from Mr. Rogers' neighborhood was a Presbyterian minister. During seminary, he had a professor who was a professor of systematic theology. His name was Dr. Bill Orr. As Fred Rogers said, he didn't really teach so much as he lived it. And he reflected a story, said on a cold, freezing day, Dr. Orr left with a heavy overcoat on, but he came back to teach that afternoon class without his overcoat. Class noticed it, and one asked, "What happened to your coat?" Dr. Orr said, "Oh, I have another one at home," and never mentioned it again. He knew that he was but a tenant in God's kingdom. We live in a property which we did not cultivate, and which we do not own. The church and the world have been placed in our care. So, do we act as if those things belong to us, or do we act as the things that we have belong to God? This is how this parable translates to us. And this is how we have to be careful not to agree with Jesus too quickly. It gets us in trouble. It's easy to think that our possessions, our resources are our own. It's easy. It's easy to see the blessings of God that He brings to us as blessings we deserve, or worse yet, owe to us. Remember last week's sermon, last week's parable. There was a church who had limited parking, and they were right next door to a grocery store that was not open on Sunday. And so the church said, well, why don't we ask the owner if we can use their parking lot on Sunday? They're not using it. And so they did, and the owner said, sure, it's fine. You can use it for 51 Sundays a year. And they said, 51, why not the other? He said, because on that day, I'm going to block the whole parking lot so that you remember it's not your parking lot, but it's mine. Right? There's great wisdom there. That's what Jesus is saying in this parable. We've used the parking lot and we begin to think it's ours. We need to move away from our own sense of entitlement, our advantages, our egos, our culture, our own self-interests. It is God's kingdom to which we belong. The psalmist says over and over and over again that the world and all that in it belongs to God. Do we believe it? Yes. Do we act that way? Oh. We need to see the bigger picture, the kingdom picture. It has no borders. The earth is the Lord's. We are tenants together with God's people everywhere. In the Depression era, Reverend Rump remembers, as a child, he said, I was fascinated by the visitors who ate on our back porch. On many occasions, I would see a strange man sitting on a chair with a small tray in front of him, eating his lunch or his dinner. If my father was home, he said, the visitor would eat with us in the kitchen. When he ate, our visitor and my father would talk. I remember how interested my father was in the visitor and what the visitor had to say. After they had eaten, my mother would pack another lunch, send him on his way, and we would never see him again. He said, one day, one of my friends was making fun of me at school. He said, your family lives with bums. When I went home and complained to my parents that my friends had said we're living with bums, my parents told me that some people call them bums because they had nowhere to live and no money to buy food, but God sent them to us to remind us of how God has a way to take care of us, and that he gave us what we had to share with visitors. Our visitors were always reminders of how God had blessed us and how we could bless others. Father called them messengers from God. We often look and see differences. Oftentimes that's the first thing we notice, and we don't get past that. Yet in each person we are called to see the face of Christ. When we stop seeing the face of Christ in others, we stop seeing Jesus. Leonardo da Vinci, in his first painting of the Last Supper, and he did many, he did in detail 2 cups that were on the table. Magnificently done. And when he showed a friend the picture, he noticed that the friend was focusing on those cups and how beautiful they were. He quickly grabbed a brush and he painted through those. He said, "Not that. That isn't what I want you to see. It's the face. Look at the face." The parable asks, who will see? What will we see? What will we do? Like with so many of the parables, there is no conclusion. It's left open-ended. The fate of the vineyard and the tenants is unresolved. Dr. Gerald Krishel said, "There's an exercise I have for you to help realize your priorities." He said, first thing, imagine that you have 1 year to live. List 3 things that you would like to do during that year. Or 2, imagine 11 months have passed. List 3 things you would like to do during your last month. 3, make a new list assuming you have 1 week left, and another assuming you only have 48 hours left. Look at your lists. Do they include activities you are not currently doing? This is a stewardship passage. What will we do with the things God has for us? Another way of looking at our priorities is to sit down with your, I don't use checkbooks anymore. Sit down with your checkbook or your Visa account when they come in and see where your money's going. Are you spending more on Netflix than you are on helping others? That's what this passage calls us to, right? It's not a simple passage and not an easy passage. We have so many ways of avoiding it, however. But you need to know, with God, our cleverness only gets us in trouble. Our attempts to avoid only get us in trouble. There's a woman who stopped at a deli on the corner to buy some chicken for supper. Butcher reached into the barrel and there was only 1 left, and he pulled it out and he weighed it, and he told her how much it weighed. She thought for a moment and said, "Well, I need one a bit larger." So he thought quickly, and he put the chicken back in the barrel, and he armed around like he was trying to grab for another one, and he pulled that chicken out again and put it on the scale and said, "Well, this one weighs 1 pound more." She thought about it for a minute, and she said, "Okay, I'll take both." Right? That's what happens when we try and avoid. What will hold us back from lovingly joining our sisters and our brothers here and around the world as good stewards of God's talents? All that God has blessed us with. At one church, there was a member who got up to share about his Christian faith. He said, "I'm a millionaire, and I attribute my wealth to the blessing of God." And he related a story from his early working days. He said, "When I first started to work, I earned my first $10 bill. And I went to church, there was a missionary speaking, and they said afterwards, we're taking an offering for this missionary. All the offering's going to go to him for his work for the church." And he thought, here's my first $10. I can't make change when the plate comes by. What am I going to do? Will I give it all? Or will I keep it? He said, I decided right then and there that I would give it. And because I did, God blessed me and I became rich. And the place was quiet. And he went back and sat down, and there was a little old lady behind him. She whispered into him, "I dare you to do it again." I dare you to do it again. Somehow it's easier with $10, isn't it? Howard Hendricks tells of a dinner conversation he and his wife had. He said, "My wife Jean and I once dined with a rich man from a blue blood Boston family. And I asked him, how in the world did you grow up in the midst of such wealth and not be consumed by materialism? He said, my parents taught us that everything in our home was either an idol or a tool. Everything in our home is either an idol or a tool." As I read that, I looked around my house. I looked in that room, and I realized there's a third category, right? And it's junk. Seriously. That was a convicting thing. You know? Everything we have is an idol or a tool or a junk. What are you going to do with the things God blesses you with? So it is in the world, the vineyard of our Lord. Everything we have is an idol or a tool. Our dessert first is a way of saying that God has blessed us richly even before we think about God. Come, enjoy, eat at our table and rejoice, and go forth grateful.